We have an exceptionally consequential election coming up. The outcomes of that election will determine whether our generation and future generations enjoy more rights with a more inclusive democracy or less rights.
Hi there. This is Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. In case you don't know us, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit operating foundation that focuses on advancing inclusive democracy. We're talking to Kettering Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. He's the former Director of European Affairs for the National Security Council under Donald Trump and was a U.S. attaché to Moscow and Kiev. There's a massive amount of news happening right now when it comes to Ukraine, Russia, NATO. Colonel Vindman is here to help us to understand what it means, how important it is, and more importantly, what it means for democracy. Colonel Vindman, thank you for talking to us.
Brad, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to having this conversation and joining the series from Kettering.
Fantastic. Let's start with the biggest question. Why does the conflict in Ukraine matter for democracy?
So I'll start with, I'm a defense national security specialist. So I'm going to start with the basics here. Think about the investments that the U.S. makes on behalf of its security. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year into defense to warn off our adversaries, to deter our adversaries from attacking us. How much would the U.S. be willing to spend if somebody were to come to the U.S. and say, hey, I have this magic device, I have this magic weapon that could basically destroy the Russian military threat to NATO, to our alliance? There would be no limit to what we would spend if we could do that without jeopardizing any American lives. In a way, that's actually what we're doing already. We are supporting the Ukrainians' drive for sovereignty and independence. They're a emerging democracy. It's a new country that's been around for a little over 30 years, separated from the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union collapsed, making progress, integrating with Europe. So certainly they capture our aspirations for the spread of democracy, recognizing that democracies offer security. Democracies are our trading partners. Democracies bolster the view of the world that we would like to have. So from that standpoint, it's a no-brainer. But from a practical democratic standpoint, they're also fending off one of the biggest culprits, one of the biggest players looking to upset democracy, the authoritarian regime that is Russia, that is aggressively fighting democracy, democratic institutions around the world and challenging U.S. primacy.
So continuing aid to Ukraine is really in question right now, right? What happens if the U.S. does not provide military assistance? Does someone step up? What happens?
It's going to be a difficult year for Ukraine, even with U.S. assistance. The fact is that we do not have enough material defense stockpiles to provide the resources that Ukraine needs. We didn't invest in those over the preceding 2 years. And as little as we've done, the Europeans have done less. So from that standpoint, it was going to be a difficult year. Absent U.S. support, it becomes really something far more dangerous with the Russians inflicting a lot more casualties on the Ukrainians and taking more territory and really setting conditions for what could amount to a very, very dangerous end of war in which Russia retains swaths of Ukrainian territory. Your question also is about whether anybody else could step up. The Europeans are stepping up in a big way as much as they can. So you have the Czechs finding 800,000 rounds of ammunition, combination of different kinds of ammunition that are critical for Ukraine. You have the Dutch, remarkably saying, look, we are not in a war. We're not fighting for our survival. Ukraine is. We will give away all our artillery, all of our ammunition. So there are different players making huge strides, but the biggest economies, the biggest arsenals are not making those kinds of commitments. Germany in particular. France could do more. The UK could do more. All total, that still probably doesn't plug the gap of the absence of the U.S., but they are stepping up and doing more, and we still need to be there. We cannot withdraw from world affairs. Even if our European allies could be doing more, I mentioned Germany and France in particular could be doing more, they cannot afford to have the U.S. withdraw because they know in that vacuum nobody else could step in, and Ukraine would be in a much, much more difficult situation that makes European security more tenuous.
You've been talking about Europe. What you mean by that, I think, is in part NATO. Why does NATO matter so much?
So NATO is a critical alliance for the United States. It's unique in that it brings together a large number of democracies with the resources of those democracies to provide collective defense for the U.S., for our allies. Europe is our biggest trading partner, most important trading partner. It is a source and an engine for democracy, democratization around the world. And it's in the news now because, let's be clear, President Trump in a rally invited Russia to attack NATO. And that is a very, very dangerous signal. It's not something that could be dismissed as a what if Trump is elected and is inaugurated in 2025. It is actually a real danger today because President Trump is the de facto leader of the Republican Party, and the signals he gives are going to be followed by the party, much like they were around the discussion around border security. So we could find ourselves in a situation in which Russia perceives that the U.S. that Congress won't be there to challenge Russian aggression against NATO, and that poses a direct, immediate threat to our troops.
To be clear, the point you're making isn't like what happens in an election. The point you're making is right now, these comments that were made create instability and danger for democracy right now.
Yes. So think about it from the standpoint of breeding miscalculation. Putin could very well misread the situation and see this as U.S. Incapable of responding to Russian aggression against NATO. That there would be paralysis in the Republican ranks in Congress and so forth. That's the minimum. I think the other way is he might interpret it as a rather clear signal that President Trump would object to Republicans supporting our NATO allies in case of a Russian attack. In either of those scenarios, it is very, very dangerous because one of the most consistent objectives of Putin has been the destruction of NATO, and he's looking for the opportunity to do that. And Donald Trump very well may have provided him what he thinks is that opportunity.
I want to talk about Vladimir Putin and what looks like a relationship with Fox News personality Tucker Carlson, who recently aired a lengthy interview with Putin. It got almost 200 million views across all its channels in the first 3 days, 2 hours long, in Moscow. What is important about that interview?
What's important is probably the fact that this media personality that was too radical for Fox News and the Fox News narrative that cost a huge settlement in terms of previous lies about stolen elections, still has a very, very vocal platform and a wide reach, and is doing the work of our enemies. So Putin took that interview because he recognizes that Tucker Carlson has a wide following, and proceeded to amplify this Russian narrative about Ukraine never existing as a real state, that the West is the belligerent propelling this confrontation. And then in the days before and after, you hear Tucker Carlson talking about how great Russia is. Somebody was talking about making America great, talking about how great things are in Russia. And of course, that is not an accurate portrayal. He happens to be in the center of one of the most expensive cities in the world, seeing a very, very small sliver of society, vast populations in Russia, millions don't have access to electricity, don't have access to plumbing. The gaps between the haves and the have-nots are enormous. It's a hallmark of authoritarian societies. We might talk about growing disparity in our democracy. It is yawning in Russia. It's not accurate that Russia is prosperous. Russia's economy in its entirety is somewhere in the ballpark of 1.8 trillion. The U.S. economy is somewhere about 27 trillion. That's an enormous gap. I mean, we're talking about like approaching 20 times bigger. And again, it's concentrated in certain areas. So I think he deserves broad criticism.
Let's shift gears just for a second. February 16th, the world was shocked, but not really surprised to hear that Alexi Navalny was dead. He was the most important opposition figure in Russia, had already survived a poisoning attempt, had been a political prisoner since January 2021. How will the world reaction matter for democracy?
Yeah. Well, the world reaction, if we take action, punitive action against Putin, who murdered Navalny. There were multiple assassination attempts. Actually, the most prominent one was the one that put him in the hospital in Germany, which the one he returned from before being arrested. So there was, really no doubt that it was Putin and his regime that murdered Navalny. So in action, if we take action against Putin and impose some costs, it at minimum serves as a warning to other authoritarian regimes that to use the tool of assassination, to use the tool of political imprisonment, comes with consequences. Inaction also is equally important here. If we fail to follow through, the president of the United States said that there'd be dire consequences for Navalny being killed by Putin. If we don't take any action, it will breed the kind of impunity that Russia has felt for likely the past decade or a couple decades, resulting in the Russia-Ukraine war. And it will also serve as an example to other regimes, again, that they can take these kinds of actions against their opponents and suffer no consequence. So I think what we do really does matter.
I mean, for democracy to thrive, to even survive, I think what you're saying is that rule of law has to matter, right? So a country can't invade a neighbor, a political figure can't assassinate their opponent. We have to have institutions, including journalism, legal, judicial, that work.
Well, that's true, and I always think about reflect my bailiwick is foreign policy and international affairs, but I always reflect back to what the dangers are in the United States. We have an exceptionally consequential election coming up. The outcomes of that election will determine whether our generation and future generations enjoy more rights with a more inclusive democracy or less rights. So I think back to what have been the events in recent U.S. history and the trend lines. Again, we have a trend line in which we have mainstream media outlets that are propagating disinformation, sowing discord. We have political parties taking extreme positions and really undermining the idea of good governance, public service, demonizing their political opponents. And I think, again, we'll have an election in which we return to some sort of normalcy, or we go down this very, very dangerous path in which we could very well end up with political reprisals against the political opponents of a party. And that is a dangerous situation. And I and the rest of the Kettering Fellows and Kettering Foundation are working hard to make sure that we don't realize that worst case scenario and that our children have a better, more prosperous future.
Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, thank you for a crash course in geopolitics and why it matters for democracy. What's next for you, and how can our viewers keep up with you?
I run a think tank called Institute for Informed American Leadership through a nonpartisan organization around a veterans group. So I appear oftentimes in the media landscape under those auspices. I also write extensively on my Substack. I've got some articles coming out separately in kind of conventional publications also. And you'll probably be seeing me on the airwaves somewhere.
Kettering Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on.